Crowds poured into the Colosseum, not for politics, not for justice, but to watch men die. Gladiators slashed and roared while exotic beasts tore prisoners apart. Meanwhile, outside the arena, Rome's slums overflowed. The Senate rotted with bribery, and emperors plotted their next purge. And yet, most people didn't revolt. They cheered. What kept the Roman public so distracted, so compliant? Two simple things: free bread and spectacular entertainment. This wasn't random. Rome's elite engineered it. The phrase bread and circuses, or panem et circenses, came from the Roman poet Juvenal. Writing in the 2nd century CE, he sneered that citizens had traded their political birthright for wheat and games. And he had a point. But the story goes much deeper, and it begins with fear. By the 2nd century BCE, the Roman Republic was strained. The city swelled with migrants, veterans, and the urban poor. Riots were frequent. Grain prices soared. In 123 BCE, reformer Gaius Gracchus proposed subsidized wheat for citizens. It wasn't charity, it was insurance. Hungry mobs were dangerous. With cheap grain, they were manageable. Fast forward a few decades, and the system hardened. In 58 BCE, under popular pressure, and with the backing of politician Clodius Pulcher, Rome began giving out free monthly grain. Not discounted, free. The Senate grumbled, but the people rejoiced. Soon, more than 150,000 male citizens were on the grain list, lining up at distribution centers every month. Julius Caesar later tried to trim the rolls, cutting recipients down to 150,000 to control costs, but the practice stayed. Food solved one part of the unrest. Entertainment handled the rest. Roman leaders didn't invent public games, but they weaponized them. From the early Republic, wealthy officials hosted ludi, public games, as part of festivals or political campaigns. These grew steadily more elaborate. Gladiator fights, beast hunts, staged naval battles, executions, each event designed to awe, distract, and dazzle. The bigger the spectacle, the more it reinforced the emperor's power. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, set the standard. In 29 BCE, after defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra, he hosted games lasting days. Over 3,500 wild animals were killed in the arena. This wasn't just celebration. It was a political message. Rome had conquered the wild, and Augustus controlled Rome. The message landed. By the time the Colosseum opened in 80 CE, emperors were judged not just by conquests, but by the quality of their games. The Colosseum itself, holding up to 50,000 people, became the center of imperial theater. Domitian's 100-day opening celebration reportedly featured thousands of animals and fighters. Some reports say 2,000 gladiators fought. Lions, tigers, elephants, exotic creatures no Roman had seen before, were paraded and slaughtered for the crowd's pleasure. And it worked. While the Senate faded in relevance and imperial succession became blood sport, the masses stayed quiet. The games kept coming. Free bread kept arriving. There was no need to rebel, at least not yet. What's striking is how institutionalized this became. Emperors weren't just entertainers, they were expected to be. Nero, despite his excess, earned cheers for performing music. Later, Commodus would step into the arena himself, dressed as Hercules, slaying beasts and sometimes men. Citizens didn't protest, they applauded. Of course, not everyone approved. Cicero, even in the Republic's waning days, warned of the dangers of dependency. He criticized both the grain handouts and the crowd's appetite for blood. But Cicero was killed. The crowds remained. Even poets and historians couldn't ignore what was happening. Juvenal, writing a century after Augustus, delivered one of the era's sharpest indictments. In Satire X, He mocked Romans who no longer cared about civic duty. They once demanded freedom, he wrote, but now they long eagerly for just two things: bread and circuses. The line stuck. It wasn't just a criticism, it was a diagnosis of empire. By the 1st century CE, this diagnosis was visibly playing out. Public funds, what we'd call the imperial budget, devoted between 20% to 30% to games, grain, and crowd management. That's a staggering amount for a society constantly at war and always building something. But emperors saw the trade-off as worthwhile. Keep the mob fed and entertained, and the palace stayed standing. There were layers to this strategy. On one hand, the grain supply itself was a logistical marvel. Rome didn't grow enough wheat locally, so grain had to come from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. The state coordinated fleets, storage, distribution points, what some scholars call an ancient welfare state. When supply chains broke, things turned ugly fast. Food riots erupted in times of shortage, especially under Nero and Claudius, so emperors invested heavily in grain routes, even building ports and ships specifically for the annona, the grain dole system. Then there was the matter of spectacle. Games weren't just one-off events. By the 2nd century, the Roman calendar was packed with official holidays, sometimes 150 days a year or more, many centered around public games. These weren't side attractions, they were the backbone of the public calendar, often more important to the average Roman than legislation or elections. Because by this point, elections barely mattered. The Republic's institutions had withered. Emperors controlled appointments. The Senate offered little more than ceremony. Power had consolidated at the top, but the illusion of popular relevance persisted through games. Citizens could still cheer. They could choose which chariot team to support: blue, green, red, or white. Factions sparked fierce loyalty, sometimes even street fights. But it was politics, drained of policy. Nationalism stripped of accountability. This wasn't just social control, it was a psychological strategy. When thousands cheer as a lion mauls a prisoner, they're not thinking about corruption or inflation. They're enthralled, maybe disgusted, but definitely not organizing a rebellion. The drama in the arena replaces the drama in the streets. Still, the system wasn't foolproof. Cracks formed. During the reign of Caracalla in the early 3rd century, grain shortages triggered unrest despite continued games. The crowds grew restless. Emperors had to promise more than bread and circuses. They had to promise safety and stability too. Over time, military spending outpaced spectacle. The border wars intensified. The empire's focus shifted. By the 4th century, lavish games became rarer. Christianity's rise also cast a moral shadow over gladiatorial combat. Constantine tolerated the games but didn't promote them. Later emperors like Honorius and Theodosius leaned toward banning certain spectacles altogether, especially those involving death. The age of blood sport waned, but the instincts behind it, distraction, spectacle, appeasement, never left. And that's what makes bread and circuses feel so modern. We've changed the costumes, the venues, the methods, but the political instinct, the need to pacify through spectacle, still hums beneath the surface. When scandals erupt and distractions multiply, the logic echoes back to Rome. Give them a show, and they might forget who's in charge.